You know about the Islamic calendar.
Yeah, vaguely.
Vaguely, I mean, of course, you at least know the fact that there is an Islamic calendar. Yeah. For with the Christian calendar, we use the terms Anno Domini, before Christ. Yeah. With the Christian calendar, the attempt is that we consider the birth of Jesus Christ as the 0 point. Anytime before that is before Christ. Anytime after that is Anno Domini, after the year of the Lord. So that's our reference point. In Islam, the reference point is what is called the Hijrah. Not Muhammad's birth year. It's the supposed Muhammad's birth year, not the supposed Muhammad's year of death, but rather the supposed Muhammad's Hijrah. You know what the Hijrah is, Mecca to Medina and so on. So that is the reference point. For instance, when you talk about Islamic resources, you actually need to, in this case, for example, the scholar who has written this article isn't even a Muslim, but when he writes about Islamic resources that are connected with Islam or connected to the Middle East, the Islamic heartland, he uses the reference of Islamic year. Hijrah, after Hijrah, 58 after Hijrah. Can you see that? But the problem is this. You see the number, you know where the number comes from? The number actually comes from, in many cases, the numbers, I have many inscriptions here. In many cases, the numbers actually come from the inscriptions themselves. The numbers come from the inscriptions themselves. Can you see? In the year 58. Yeah, in the year 58. And that is what the scholars pick up on. And he has quoted the fact that this inscription seems to date from 58 AH. Yeah, but here is the problem. The scholar today calls it 58 AH. But what did the inscription call itself as? It just says year 58. It has no reference to what is called the Hijrah. It says year 58. You know what? The only other context that it provides, with an Islamic tone is this title called the title called the Commander of the Believers, where the word the believers seems to be used time and time again. The word believers seems to be used time and time again. If you knew Arabic, al-mu'minin, believers. So the reference point used is what is called year of the jurisdiction of the believers. No reference to Hijrah.
The study of the inscription marked year 58 touches on a fundamental question in early Islamic historiography, namely how and when the Hijri calendar truly came into existence and was formally established. In the traditional Islamic narrative, the Hijri calendar is linked to the migration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE. Yet from a critical historical perspective, there is no contemporary evidence showing that the Hijri system was actually in use immediately after that event. The formal adoption of the Hijri calendar is mentioned only in Islamic sources written much later, during the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab. These sources explain that the calendar was instituted for administrative purposes as the early Islamic state began to take shape. However, those texts themselves date from the 8th and 9th centuries, and therefore cannot serve as direct eyewitness testimony to what supposedly happened more than a century earlier. This raises an important historical question. Did 7th century communities genuinely count their years from the Prophet's migration, or was this system only designed and applied retroactively once Islam had become a consolidated political power? Within this context, the inscription bearing the words year 58 is often cited as evidence that the Hijri system was already in use in early Islam. But epigraphic analysis shows that such a conclusion is far from certain. The inscription simply reads year 58. There's no mention of the word Hijrah, no phrase saying after the Hijrah. In other words, it states a year, but does not identify the chronological system to which it belongs. During that era, the Middle East employed several overlapping dating systems: the Byzantine era, the Nabatean era, the Seleucid era, and various local Arabian systems. Therefore, the year 58 in question could easily refer to one of these, not to the Hijri calendar. What happened later was a process of retrospective interpretation. Medieval Muslim historians, writing centuries later in a world where the Hijri calendar was already standard, naturally interpreted all earlier dates through the only chronological lens familiar to them. Over time, that simple number, 58, began to be read as year 58 after the Hijrah.
You know, could you imagine a Muslim walking around?
What is it? Okay, before going too much into
Yeah.
your technical stuff,
Yeah.
obviously you can drag on. So what's your overall...
So my overall comment based on that one inscription, my overall conclusion based on that one inscription is Islam today, Islam of 9th century and later, tell us a story about Muhammad, of this person called Muhammad, of this religion called Islam and so on. It tells us that there are various religious texts, various religious practices and so on. But go to the earliest of resources, because these 9th century and later resources are late in comparison to the supposed Muhammad himself. But if you go to the earliest of resources, what you find is the earliest of resources do not record a person called Muhammad. It could be for one of two reasons. Number one, could be maybe he didn't exist in the particular way he is seen today. Or alternatively, even if there was a person called Muhammad, he was irrelevant to their jurisdiction. He was irrelevant to how they were trying to reach out to God during the time of Muawiyah, if you see what I mean. So clearly Muawiyah says, Muawiyah has some sort of a prayer. You know, this belongs to the servant of God, and he says, built it with the permission of God. So some sort of reference to God, but with no reference to Muhammad. In other words, the earliest of evidence that we find contradicts the later supposed history that is being told to us. And in other words,
Without knowing too much about history,
yeah,
just in a common sense,
yeah,
is that you get two historians.
yeah.
You coming from a certain school, right, with all the evidence. I'm just saying, for argument's sake, there could be someone from the Muslim side who could have listened.
Yeah, and that is where Hanif,
You know what I mean?
Hanif,
So,
Hanif.
I mean, I don't know that side or your side too much, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, this is one of the problems, Hanif, and I'm going to actually give you sort of homework in this regard, please. The problem is this. You know, most Muslims you see today here, most Muslims, if I were to engage with them with this, they'll actually give an answer, like if they are sensible, if they are reasonable, their answer would be something similar to what you're saying in, you know, different kinds of statements. You know, something like, oh, I don't know enough to actually make a comment, but someone else might have a better comment, that sort of stuff. But here is the problem. You see what Islam has done to you? Islam has convinced all these Muslims, or at least you, might not be as as zealous as some of the others are, but the zealous ones would have a similar answer to you, which means Islam has raised up zealots with ignorance of history. How can you have a zealot? You know, I am a zealot for Jesus Christ. Through God's grace, I'd like to give up my life for Jesus Christ. Even though I have a family, I have a kid and so on, I am willing to. Why? Because I understand my Lord Jesus Christ has done tremendous things for me. Not just for me, but also for my family, also for my friends, also for the entire world. His love for this, for people like you is tremendous. So in that context, I'm willing to even lay down my life. I'm a zealot for the Lord Jesus Christ. But why?
You could have equally the same people who would lay their lives for the Prophet.
Exactly the point. My point is, my zeal comes from a knowledge of Jesus Christ, a knowledge of the history of Jesus Christ. I am willing to do what I am willing to do because I am convicted and convinced based on my analysis and my research that this Jesus is historically true. The love that I hear from, the love of Jesus that I hear from various people and various resources is actually true. Now, in contrast, you have zealots walking around. But what is the difference between me and them? Their zeal is not based on research on history. Their zeal is based on ignorance. Most of these people, I challenge you, Hanif, most of these people would have no rebuttal to what I'm talking about here because they would have no knowledge.
In the archaeological record of the 7th century, the name Muhammad does appear, most notably on the inscription inside the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan around 691 CE. The inscription reads, Muhammadun abdu Allah wa rasulu. Muhammad is the servant of God and his messenger. At first glance, this seems to confirm the traditional Islamic narrative that Muhammad was already widely known at that time as a prophet. Yet, when examined through the lens of linguistics and historical context, the phrase is not as straightforward as it appears. In Arabic, the name Muhammad comes from a root word that means to praise. So, quite literally, Muhammad means the one who is praised, or simply, the praiseworthy. This opens the possibility that, in the context of early inscriptions, Muhammad may have functioned as a theological title rather than a personal name. If that's the case, the phrase Muhammadun Rasul Allah could simply mean the praiseworthy one is the messenger of God. It's less a mention of a man's name and more a spiritual confession, a statement of faith, not necessarily a reference to a specific historical figure. This interpretation is supported by several modern scholars, including John Wansbrough, Patricia Crone, and Michael Cook, who argue that Islam, as we know it today, did not emerge fully formed in the 7th century. Rather, it developed gradually and reached its definitive structure between the 8th and 9th centuries. In the earliest period, they see a broader Arab monotheistic movement, which later rewrote its origins and established a central prophetic figure, Muhammad, as the bearer of divine revelation. Other epigraphic evidence, such as coins and inscriptions from the early Umayyad era, also display similar religious formulas mentioning Allah and the Messenger, sometimes accompanied by the word Muhammad. Yet these artifacts lack any historical framing. There are no dates referring to a birth or death, no stories of battles, and no hints that these early communities possessed a detailed biography of a prophet like the one found in later Islamic tradition. This suggests that the use of the name Muhammad in the 7th century functioned more as an ideological marker than as a historical description. It was only 2 centuries later, under the Abbasid Caliphate, that works such as the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, composed around 760 CE and later edited by Ibn Hisham in the early 9th century, appeared. In these texts, we encounter the fully developed image of the Prophet Muhammad, a man born in Mecca, recipient of revelation, political leader, and lawgiver. But from a critical historical standpoint, these accounts were written long after the period they claim to describe. They reflect the theological and political needs of the Muslim community in the Abbasid era rather than contemporary eyewitness testimony.